Outlook Week. The World Energy Outlook is a flagship publication of the IEA, which provides a comprehensive overview of the global energy system. In 2020, we had a special focus on the impacts of the coronavirus crisis on the energy system, the possibilities and the opportunities to link the economic recovery efforts from the coronavirus shock with the clean energy transitions and sustainability agenda. And last but not least, for the first time, we also had a detailed modeling of a 2050 zero carbon 1.5 degrees trajectory. Today, we are going to start the 1 week series of deep diving into the World Energy Outlook with a distinguished panel discussing the impacts of the coronavirus crisis on energy. We will start with a short presentation by my colleagues Stephanie Buchard and Tae-Yoon Kim, outlining what were the World Energy Outlook's key findings of the impacts of the coronavirus crisis. And then we are going to have comments and suggestions from some of the leading experts from various regions of the world economy. We are going to have Mr. Niki Utama from the ASEAN Center for Energy giving us comments on Southeast Asia, Ms. Angela Luzzi, Strategic Advisor of the United Nations Development Program covering Africa, Mr. Arias Yanez, the Chief of the Energy Division of the Inter-American Development Bank on Latin America, and Mr. Nigel Payne, Senior Economist of the OECD, who will share with us the OECD's research on Europe and North America. So without any further ado, I would like to pass the floor to the World Energy Outlook team, to Tae-Yoon and Stephanie. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rajlo. So I will first share my screen. And it's a pleasure to talk about the key findings of the World Energy Outlook 2020 with the focus on the impact of COVID-19. So when we put together our annual energy scenarios, and we take into account various factors from the technology cost, from prices and population, the resource constraint, the investment dynamics, but there are two most important factors that underpin the annual modeling exercise. The first is the pace of economic growth, and the second one is the energy policies adopted by government. And the post-COVID context is about how the government put the sustainability into their recovery plans. So in the last year, in the World Energy Outlook 2019, we expected around 3%, 6% of annual GDP growth. And that translated into roughly 1% of annual demand growth. But 1 year on with the COVID-19, and we are in a very different place. And this year, in our stated policy scenario, which take into account the impact of the existing policies and also announced policy intentions, and we now expect around 30% of the annual GDP growth. And because of this lower economic growth, and energy demand is lower too. But with one of the key features in this scenario is that we assume the pandemic is gradually brought under control over the course of 2021. And this is the key assumptions in this state policy scenario. And this might be the case with the news of a vaccine last week, but what if these assumptions are too optimistic? The pandemic might stay with us for longer, have a lasting damages on our economic and social lives. And we examined this case in our delayed recovery scenario. And in this delayed recovery scenario, the economic slump takes much longer to shake off, and there's also some damages to the long-term growth potentials. And what does it mean for the energy? So in the stated policy scenario, the energy demand gets back to pre-crisis levels by early 2023. And in the case of delayed recovery, and it takes much longer to recover by around 2025 and stays much lower than under the pre-crisis projections. And this is the overall picture about total energy demand. But beneath these lines, and there's a lot more happening among the different technologies and fuels, and that makes up the energy system. And this is our updated assessment about the energy demand in 2020 by fuel. And in total energy demand, it's set to fall by 5% in 2020 year as a whole. But the impact on each fuel and each technologies have been uneven. And some technologies, some fuels like oil and coal registered so quite deep declines, like 7 or 8% decline in the 2020 year as a whole. But on the other hand, the demand for renewables remained quite resilient. And in fact, we are expecting a slight increase in the demand for renewables in 2020. And this trend and this contrast broadly extend into our projections in the state policy scenario. So this is the projection in the state policy scenario. And oil demand edges ahead pre-crisis levels by 2023 and continue to grow, but at a much slower pace than before. And we think the coal demand goes into structural decline because of the rise of renewables and also low natural gas prices, and also some policies to phase out coal-fired plants in many countries and regions. And gas fares relatively better, especially in the developing economies in Asia, and helped by some ample supply in the global market and also low international prices. But the main event, the big winner, is on the right side, renewables. Renewables grows very strongly in the main scenario, and because of this, thanks to the falling technology cost and also supportive government policies, and also favoring the favorable financing conditions. And what happens to this picture if there's some delayed recoveries in the event of delayed recoveries? And here, renewables are affected a little bit because there are some delays in project execution and financing conditions become more challenging, but broadly, again, the renewables proves to be quite resilient. But the largest impact are elsewhere on oil, coal, gas. The oil demand, almost all of the growth in oil demand growth is wiped out. And the coal, gas demand are also heavily affected by the weaker economic outlook. So looking at this picture, there will be increasing pressure for the companies and countries that produce oil, gas, and coal fossil fuels. And the combination of the lower demand and lower prices for hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal means the present value of tomorrow's oil, gas, coal production to 2040 will be much lower in this year's projections. Compared with the last year's projection, and in the state policy scenario, we expect almost 25% reduction in the present value of tomorrow's oil and gas productions. And the reduction will be much higher in the case of delayed recovery by almost 40%. And this picture poses some serious questions about the countries that rely heavily on the hydrocarbon revenue to run their economies, and also companies that produce oil, gas, and coal. And on the countries, and we saw in many of the producing countries in the Middle East and Africa, we saw a huge reduction in the hydrocarbon income. And that had a ripple impact on their macroeconomic operations and also public expenditure, health expenditures. So the need to diversify away from this hydrocarbon-dependent economic structure and reform their economies became ever greater than before in history. But although the conditions to pursue the diversification and reform became more challenging, but the need, the change to diversify away from hydrocarbon-dependent economy become unavoidable in this scenario. And also there are some implications for companies. There are growing social demand from community and society for companies to clarify their implications of the energy transition on their business models and operations. And on the one hand, companies will need to find new sources of revenue in the era of energy transition, either it be offshore wind, hydrogen, CCUS, whatever. But to complement this traditional oil and gas revenue, and companies will need to find a new sources of revenue compatible with the energy transition period. And also, it is not about the new businesses. Also, there's an increasing, growing scrutiny over the emissions occurring along the production value chain. So it is not just about the low-cost resources. It is both low-cost resources and also low-emission resources, what will be important in the future. So overall, the diversification and this adapting to this energy transition became even more greater important in the post-COVID situation. And there are also the other impact of COVID-19 on the other part of the energy system, on energy access and emissions and behavioral factors. And my colleague Stephanie will talk about this aspect in the following slide. Now over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks a lot, Taeyun. So indeed, most of the presentation has focused up until now on the COVID-19 impacts on energy demand. But the COVID crisis has also introduced a big debate on the potential role of behavioral factors having lasting impacts on long-term energy demand. In 2020, we were in extensive lockdowns, and some of us are still experiencing one. We had to work remotely. We have avoided flight travels. Of course, these changes had important impacts on energy demand, as we have seen, but most of these changes were forced changes, not changes that we have made by our choice. So while we will recover from the pandemic, some of these changes may dissipate over time, while some others may stay with us for longer and then having lasting impacts on long-term energy demand. In this year WEO Outlook, we have tried to assess these lasting impacts, and we can have a look, for example, at oil demand in the transport sector. So traditionally, there were two important drivers to offset the demand growth for oil demand in the transport sector. So namely, efficiency and fuel switching to electricity, fuel switching to natural gas, to biofuels, and more recently to hydrogen. And so these two drivers had an important role in offsetting the demand growth for oil in the transport sectors. And in addition, we'll see that we will have maybe some increased teleworking, we will have a delay in terms of new car purchases, and there will be less business flights in the future. So all of these help to further reduce oil demand in the transport sector. But there are also some countervailing elements. So as I've said, we have a delay in terms of new car purchases, but this will have also an implications in terms of the stock turnover, implications on energy efficiency. And even with the crisis, we see that people continue to prefer to buy SUVs when they buy new cars, rather than small ones. In addition, they prefer to use their own cars, their personal cars, rather than relying on public transport. And all of these mean that oil demand will increase even further by an additional 50,000 barrels per day by 2030. So meaning that behavioral factor won't have a big decline impact within the current policy context. So this is in the stated policy scenario, so within the current policy environment. This is not to say that there is not a role for behavior in the future to help reducing emissions. There is clearly a role, but this needs to come with the right policies and with consumer awareness. And this will be explored in much more detail by our colleagues on Thursday when there will be a session looking at pathways to net zero emissions. The pandemic had also important implications beyond the energy sector, and one of them is on reaching the Sustainable Development Goal 7, which aims to achieve universal access to energy, so universal access to electricity and universal access to clean cooking. Since 2013, the number of people without access to electricity in Africa has been declining, thanks to important progress made in some countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, like Kenya, Senegal, Rwanda, and Ghana. But with the pandemic, this number is set to increase again. We expect that in 2020, the number of people without access to electricity will increase to close to 600 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa, with 5 countries in the continent being home to half of them. And this is due to multiple reasons, because governments had to shift their priorities to emergency measures, and because the private sectors deploying solar home systems or mini-grids had to face financial and operational challenges. But the pandemic has also implications for people that have already access to electricity today. We have assessed that by the end of 2020, up to 30 million people in Africa will no longer be able to afford for basic energy services, even though they have already access to electricity today. And the future is very concerning. In case of a delayed recovery, so in the delayed recovery scenario, we see that the number of people without access to electricity will increase to 630 million people by 2030. So far, far away from reaching the universal goal of universal access by 2030. And the pandemic has implications on energy access, but also on CO2 emissions. So here we have the CO2 emissions from last year trajectories from our previous editions before the crisis. And in this year, with the pandemic, as Tiyun said, by 2020, energy demand is set to decrease by 5%, and CO2 emissions are set to decline by 7%, given the bigger impacts on coal and oil demand. And we see that in the stated policy scenario, or central scenario, the CO2 emissions will rebound to 2019 levels a bit before 2030, and then will remain roughly stable. So a bit different from the trend we had last year, where we were seeing a gradual increase. In the case of a delayed recovery, so in the case of the delayed recovery scenario, we have a bigger drop in 2020, but also in 2021, and then CO2 emissions will rise again, but will never get back to 2019 levels. However, if you think this is a good outcome, this is clearly not the case, because this reduction in the delayed recovery scenario compared to the stated policy scenario happens for all the wrong reasons. And that's something you can see on the right-hand side figure, showing you the drivers, explaining the difference between the delayed recovery scenario and the stated policy scenario in terms of emissions reductions. And you clearly see that the reductions in the delayed recovery scenario is only due to the lower economic activity, and that we have lower investments in terms of energy efficiency and renewables that have a negative impact in terms of CO2 reductions. These two trends are, of course, far from reaching the Paris Agreement goal of well below 2 degrees increase in temperature by the end of the century, but these two trends are not set in stone, and the recovery from the pandemic is uncertain. So there's not a need to have a trade-off between economic growth and emissions reduction. And that's something we have highlighted in another scenario, which is the sustainable development scenario. Into this scenario, we have also an improvement in terms of air quality. We are in line with the Sustainable Development Goal 7, so we reach universal access to energy by 2030, and we are in line with the Paris Agreement. The Sustainable Recovery Plan that was introduced in a report that we have launched in June, and sustainable recovery packages introduced by several countries are included into this scenario. And with all of these, we could make 2019 a definitive peak in terms of global CO2 emissions, and we will put countries on a pathway towards reaching climate goals. So we are really at a turning point, and we just need to make sure that the recovery is as sustainable as possible. Thanks a lot for all your attention, and I'll give you the floor again to Laszlo. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Teyun, for this very comprehensive overview of the impacts of the coronavirus crisis. I would like to encourage our audience that if you would like to ask questions or make comments, you can do so by sending a short email to weoweek@iea.org. Or those of you who are following us on YouTube, you can directly write in your questions into the YouTube chat function. We are going to see those questions, and we are going to do our best to address them. So now, after the World Energy Outlook setting the scene, I think now we are going to have a short round the world tour of looking at the specific developments and challenges and opportunities in the key regions of the world economy, taking advantage of the wisdom of some of the leading energy experts. So I would start with Southeast Asia, and Mr. Utama, I would like to ask you that the IE has been working with ASEAN for quite a while, and we have an annual tradition of developing a specific regional outlook for the ASEAN countries. And one of the interesting features of that is the very robust role of coal in the ASEAN region. Up until very recently, most countries in the ASEAN region regarded coal as the backbone of the energy system and regarded coal as essential for energy security. Now, the pandemic coincided also with a hardening of investment attitudes towards coal. Major financial institutions implemented bans on coal financing, and we have even seen major engineering companies announcing that they are no longer going to take orders for coal-fired power generation equipment. So could you explain that how Southeast Asian countries are changing their energy policy and energy strategy in the light of this dual change of the unprecedented macroeconomic shock and also a much more skeptical investor attitudes towards coal?
Yeah, thank you, Laszlo. In the power sectors, Southeast Asia having a quite big impact in regard with this COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of example in the power companies in Southeast Asia, for example, like the PLN in Indonesia, Tenaga Berhad in Malaysia, Meralco in the Philippines, facing a very significant drop in sales, resulting in lower revenues in the first half of this year. In Indonesia itself, it is very tough and difficult. Their loss have been evident since the end of this first year. Meanwhile, the Philippines and TNB saw their earnings fall by the end of the second quarter, and facing the net profit decline in the Philippines around 6.8 billion pesos. Yeah, of course, there is the big impact in terms of the and in terms of the power sectors, and you may know that the coal is the backbone currently in Southeast Asia. According to our energy outlook that will be launched this week during a ministerial meeting, we still predicting that up until 2040, the coal still quite appealing for the region as a backbone, since it is reliable enough and also, of course, affordable enough for the region, since the region having really demanding on the affordable point of interest, and the COVID-19 giving even a severe impact on the economics. Therefore, the option on having a more affordable energy supply is always the priority. However, in regard with the energy transition, that to phase out the they call it the dirty fuel, the region also having strategic energy planning, which is increasing the RE 23% in 2025, which also will be launched this week on our ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation Phase 2. And this target seems to be even harder, if I can say honestly, that we need a huge investment on providing investment in terms of the RE sectors, since the region also right now the investment of this government are focusing on the, as I mentioned, the economic recovery. Therefore, the investment on the RE still a bit lag behind. As I want to mention that for example, the Myanmar, for example, they have what you call it, the delayed some of the projects in the RE. Malaysia also postponing their investment on the RE, including the Indonesia as well as Vietnam. So the most important thing is that how we can put the investment on the priority on the power sectors, which is non-fossil fuel driven power. So that's I think that will be quite important in the region to to look after or look for the potential of the investor to go on this direction. And the subsidies still heavily happening in the region in order to maintain the economic afloat, and of course also some of the incentive in the energy sectors, mostly focusing on the tariff reduction in the country like Brunei Darussalam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos PDR, Philippines, as well as Thailand and Vietnam, and also the targeted customer to reduce the electricity prices in the residential sectors on the first lowest tier and second lowest tier in most of the countries in the region. And I think those will be some of the incentives that in the region have to do in order to maintain the economic afloat while facing the COVID-19 pandemics. Thank you. I think that's coming from my side. Laszlo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Utama. As you know, the International Energy Agency has been working very closely with the ASEAN energy ministers, and we also have a very successful association partnership with both Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore. So some of the recent contributions included working on gas market reforms, on electricity infrastructure, integrating electricity markets in the ASEAN region. We see a very strong potential for clean energy to making a faster progress and contributing to the economic recovery, and we are looking forward to contributing to that in the region. But let's continue our round trip around the world to Africa. So I would like to invite Mr. Lucy G to give comments to us. And I would also like to know your opinion is that if I'm asked about what was the single most promising, most uplifting development in the global energy system in the past couple of years, my vote to that would be that in the past couple of years we have witnessed an acceleration of electrification in Africa, and it's not simply a faster electrification, but also much cleaner electrification. So compared to, let's say, 5 to 10 years ago, much more people got their first electricity and were able to move from poverty to a modern society, and the average carbon intensity of that new electricity supply became much more favorable due to both off-grid renewables and also large-scale renewables like hydropower. Now, unfortunately, as my colleagues described in the World Energy Outlook presentation, we see a very clear risk that the coronavirus epidemic can derail this progress. So could you tell us how do we regain momentum on this? So what is the role of governments, the international community of development banks to achieve the energy-related sustainable development goals despite the challenges of the coronavirus?
Thank you so much, Laszlo. That's a very good question, and I do agree that we are celebrating a lot of progress. And as you mentioned, over 20 million Africans are getting access to electricity every year, which is quite good. And the good news is that for our 600 billion Africans who still do not have access, that is less than half of the 1.3 billion Africans. But going forward, if we really look at the goal that we want to achieve by 2030, universal access, then we will even have to triple or quadruple the rate of actual connections in order to achieve that goal. So unfortunately, while we have that grand objective, then COVID happens. And the first thing that COVID did was reveal a huge energy divide in Africa. So while on average, we're saying 1 in 2 don't have access, in North Africa, Southern Africa, you could have 80% access to electricity, while in other countries, it's way, way below that. So that's the first huge divide. The second divide that we have is around the fact that Africa's energy is mostly half of Africa's energy is produced in 4 countries. So basically, after you discount Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Algeria, the rest of the countries actually have to share, half of the energy that is being produced. So really, we're underperforming, and there's a long way to go when it comes to addressing this issue. The third divide is around urban areas, the urban-rural gap. Right, a lot is happening in urban areas. We're not seeing as much in rural areas, but the good news is that with the off-grid solutions and the renewables, there is a big push to be able to reach some of the disadvantaged area. But also within urban areas, there's a great divide between the unplanned settlements and other areas. So there are a lot of gaps that we still have to address, and COVID has revealed how significant those are, not just in addressing COVID, but also in the recovery. So going forward, I'd like to address three major impacts from COVID on the energy sector. First is the aspect of fiscal space. As was mentioned, now the government has to fight, this health pandemic. They have to also shore up areas that, the socioeconomic impact. So a lot of the fiscal space is tightening. And we really don't have that much space to borrow because everybody is suffering right now, right? So even being able to access financing is a problem. Then the private sector is also becoming more risk averse. So partners who would otherwise be coming to partner and look at renewables and so on in African countries are suddenly going to be much more risk averse and will not be so willing to take the jump. And then the final area was mentioned is that with livelihoods at risk, we're also going to lose some of the gains because even some of the households that were able to afford and access electricity before will not be able to access electricity anymore and may fall back on biofuels and so on and so forth. So looking forward and what really can be done to gain momentum back to where we would like to be. The first solution that I think that governments need to look into, which is something that they can do even with the resources they have, is to fix the grid network. We have a lot of waste and inefficiency that just happens because of poor maintenance of the grid network. There's a lot of loss that is going on. We could be able to reach much more people if we just had a more efficient grid network and built on that to really have the backbone for it. The second area is really looking at the aspect of distribution. One of the things that we've seen in many of our governments is that a lot of everything is run, and run by public institutions, which might not be the most efficient, especially in getting to the last mile. So definitely looking at areas around distribution, how can we work with SMEs and so on and so forth to be able to delink the actual production from the distribution of energy, which will help us to reach much more people. And the third area, especially in Africa, is the energy mix. Really, there's a lot of good news around renewables, but the bottom line is that 45% of the energy is actually coming from biofuels, right? So next to that is oil and then gas. And one of the things, less than 1% from solar and wind. So definitely this is something that needs to be addressed as much as possible. And a quick win, honestly, from where I sit is looking at how we can utilize gas, because that's clean. If it could actually be an affordable source of cooking fuel for many, and would really go a long way into addressing this gap. The fourth area that is very close to my heart is around fixing the skills gap. We know there's a lot of interest in introducing solutions on the continent, but we also need to look at the whole ecosystem around renewables, around a lot of this technology that is being introduced on the continent. So definitely, I think that governments should invest in skills and in R&D and making sure that these economies are also able to come up with homegrown solutions. And then the final area that I think will help us get momentum is regional collaboration. As the funding dries up, we will have to start looking at cross-border solutions. We will have to start looking at how we can deal with the issue of the small market so that where we are producing energy, we're able to have a more effective system of distributing energy. So those are the 5 areas that I think need to be a focus for African governments as they recover from COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Luceji, for this very enlightening comments. I'm a former electricity regulator, so your comments on the electricity network were especially close to my heart, because I often have the impression that the undeniable, very promising success of off-grid solutions in Africa has a tendency to deflect attention of the need to build a robust, reliable electricity network, and that's an important infrastructure development. And I'm also very glad that you brought up the challenge of the access to capital and lack of financing, because while this is a major challenge in Africa and this contributes to keeping people in poverty, Europe, where we are headquartered, has financial institutions which are right now sitting on 10,000 billion euros of negative interest rate bonds, and they are complaining about not being able to do anything useful with all that cheap money that the major central banks flooded into the economy. And when we have one part of the world economy essentially flooded with negative interest rate capital, and a couple of thousand kilometers from there, we have people being trapped in poverty because of lack of investment into clean energy sources. This for me suggests that there is a historical opportunity to leverage finance in a more effective fashion to help clean energy developments in Africa. Now let's move on to Latin America, and also if I might take back my former electricity regulator hat. One thing that I find very interesting in Latin America is the way that the region has emerged as a very promising laboratory of regulatory innovation. Some of the most innovative market design and regulatory solutions emerged in Mexico, in Brazil, in Chile, in other Latin American countries. And I think that has a global significance beyond the region. Now, one thing I would like to ask from Mr. Epez is that how the Latin American governments build on this intellectual tradition of very creative, very innovative regulation and policy design, and counterbalance the fact that from a medical point of view, unfortunately, Latin America had a very, very serious epidemic, so the challenges are quite high. So, Mr. Epez, if you could share your insights with us.
Sure. Thank you, Laszlo. In fact, well, thanks a lot for the invitation, and just let me share with you some thoughts about the question that you just raised and some of the things that have happened so far in Latin America and the Caribbean. Well, COVID-19 was a shock in the electricity demand, in energy demand in general, but particularly in electricity demand in some countries in Latin America. The drop in rates were around 30% in countries such as Peru and Bolivia. And the impact of COVID-19 in the electricity sector, to some extent, is twofold. The quick and sharp drop consequences of sanitary measures and the longer impact of decrease of economic activity. The region has recovered most of the first impact, the sanitary measures, and the power systems were resilient to the shock to some extent. So the GDP in Latin America is expected to be one of the most impacted globally. And the relation of the GDP and electricity sector is straightforward. More GDP means more electricity demand and more jobs. In Latin America, we estimate that 1 million invested in the energy sector generates about 8 direct jobs. In this context, energy sector shouldn't be just a passive sector reacting to the crisis we are facing. The energy sector can be a proactive sector driving the green recovery the region needs. And to some extent, what we have seen is that countries in the region have been very active in improving and bringing this, what you were talking about, these innovative solutions to bring more renewable energy to the energy sector. Particularly, something that the region has been not only proactive, but creative, is on the auction processes that we have for renewable energy. Very successful. Where as a consequence of that, we have an important drop in prices for renewable energy across the whole region. And that's something that is going to be critical in the years to come. The investments in the recovery should allow Latin America to leapfrog historical challenges in the energy sector. It is an opportunity for all the multilaterals, including the Inter-American Development Bank, to support the region to follow the sustainable recovery path. And in fact, when you were talking about when Stephanie was talking about the sustainable development scenario, that's something that we are looking for, that we are trying to make happen in the region. And what we are trying to do is to support this whole effort to move into the direction of having a more sustainable recovery path, considering 3 different platforms. One is decarbonizing the economy, the second one is digitalizing the sector, and the third one is improving services. On decarbonizing the economy, as you know, more than 60% of the region's electricity generation comes from renewable energy sources. That is a huge amount compared to 26% of the world average. And a large amount of renewable natural resources availability enables the region to have more ambitious goals. Given the fiscal constraints that the pandemic imposes on governments, while private investments needs to be a critical part of the financing effort, and that is happening, and that has been happening in the last 10 years, basically. Development banks can have a comparative advantage, supporting countries to establish market conditions and regulatory mechanisms. An effective example in Latin America has been supporting auctions with long-term power purchase agreements. And what we have been doing in a very proactive manner is that the lessons learned in countries, as you said, as Chile, Mexico, and Brazil, we have been bringing that experience to other countries in the region. Renewable energy sources can grow not only through large generation projects, but also in distributed generation. Although it represents only a small portion of electricity matrix at this moment, at a regional level, the growth rate is exponential in several countries such as Brazil, Chile, and Mexico precisely. The main limitation for non-conventional renewable sources, as we know, is no longer price, it is basically variability. So energy storage with lithium batteries, hydrogen, and other storage options is a priority in the region, and we have been thinking very seriously about that, especially at this moment, because we know that it is going to be critical in the years to come to bring those technologies to complement the introduction of more renewable energy in the energy matrix. A strong transmission network is also necessary for the electrical system to benefit from the complementarity between different renewable sources, geographically distant, and we have seen that especially in the South Cone. This is a very good time to strengthen the network, making it ready to connect all the different generation sources with the consumption points. As I said, digitalization is another important element, and as a consequence, we can see an increase of affordability of services in the whole region with more digitalization. And because of that, what we saw in Latin America is that because many utilities have been moving forward that agenda of digitalization, in fact, we didn't face lots of disruptions as a consequence of the pandemic. And that is something that has been happening, and it will continue happening in the years to come. And finally, the third point that I was talking about, improving the quality of services. But that means access, affordability, and of course, quality of services. In Latin America, we have 19 million people without energy access. And we estimate that in the coming 10 years, it's going to be necessary to put in the economy more than $25 billion to close that gap. On affordability, it is critical for the region to continue working in reducing the electricity cost. And we have been very effective doing that, including more renewable energy in the generation matrix of most of the countries in the region. And quality, well, improving quality for those with frequent blackouts and outages is critical, and bringing best practices to utilities to reduce those outages and to improve the quality of services is fundamental. Well, and to finish my intervention, well, the IDB supports countries in several manners, from traditional investment loans to technical assistance to improve regulations for renewables, supporting auctions, as I said, licensing tools and market reforms and so on. We have been doing that, and we will continue doing that because we think it is important in the years to come. And for lending renewable energy is going to be critical, especially for the private sector window that we have very active in the last few months. Thank you, Laszlo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abbas. I certainly see Latin America as a taste of things to come in the future, given that the backbone of the electricity supply is already low carbon. So Latin America increasingly is working on dealing with very challenging geographies, developing new infrastructure, electrifying other parts of the economy. And what will be also interesting to see how Latin America, which for a century has been traditionally a commodity exporter, is now actually emerging as a potential exporter of low carbon hydrogen based on its unique renewable energy resources. The IE has been also working with Latin America. We just recently hosted a summit of Latin American energy ministers, and that's going to be a very exciting journey in the future. Now I would turn to Mr. Nigel Payne to give us some comments about Europe and the United States. And Nigel, we had one dilemma when we did the modeling of the world energy outlook, and namely that what should we assume about monetary policy? Because most low carbon resources, like a wind turbine or an electric car, require a significant initial capital investment, but then they are almost free to operate. So the lower the cost of capital, the better the competitiveness of those low carbon resources. Of course, major central banks, both in Europe and the United States, reacted to the coronavirus crisis by an unprecedented wave of monetary easing. And that led for us to question that should we assume a zero interest rate environment for 20 years? This happened in Japan, but is it likely to happen in Europe or the United States? How does the monetary policy environment affect the energy transition? And how can we most effectively leverage this window of opportunity to further clean energy investment? So Nigel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Laszlo, and thank you for the invitation to this very interesting seminar. As you say, major central banks, the Federal Reserve in the United States, the European Central Bank, have taken extensive monetary policy action since the onset of the pandemic. It's important to stress that comes on top of a decade of extensive monetary policy action we've already had in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So we've had low interest rates for an extended period. We've had expanding balance sheets in the major central banks. And really that is likely to continue. Demand is relatively weak compared to what we had previously expected. And that's going to keep downward pressures on inflation. There's no sign, if you look at inflation expectations, that there is a broad indication that inflation is going to take off anytime soon. So interest rates are likely to stay low. It doesn't necessarily mean they stay at zero or are negative, other than in the very short term. If we look at the last 5 to 10 years, long-term interest rates, the US 10-year interest rate is a benchmark for financial markets around the world. That's tended to be somewhere between 1% and 2%. At the moment, it's close to 1%. You would think if a recovery takes place, and that's still very uncertain, that you would have slightly higher interest rates than you have now. But certainly it's going to stay low. I think in terms of leveraging that, then a lot of this is going to depend on what governments do. Low interest rates do send a signal that the cost of capital is low, and that should encourage companies to invest. But again, the experience of the last 10 years or so with low interest rates suggests that that in itself is not enough to encourage companies to invest. And indeed, many companies don't change their hurdle rate of investment, their hurdle cost of capital, which is the key metric, their internal metric for undertaking investment projects, even though interest rates have come down. So a lot falls on the shoulders of government. And in contrast to what Angela was saying for Africa, there's plenty of fiscal space available in Europe and North America, in our view, even after the extensive actions that governments have undertaken this year to support companies and workers through the pandemic. Low interest rates means that the burden of higher debt for these governments is not really substantial at present. And that gives scope for governments to undertake new public infrastructure projects, investment in clean energy infrastructure, to provide incentives, perhaps for the private sector, to change behavior, move towards things like greater use of renewables, electric cars, and so on. People do respond to tax incentives, but also to undertake some of the regulatory reforms that are perhaps necessary to encourage more competition, give the right signals for companies to invest. And one important reform I think it is worth mentioning in the context of the pandemic is encouraging those companies who are receiving financial support or assistance from the government to make stronger environmental commitments. It shouldn't just be the case of governments funding companies such as airlines to go back to business as normal. There should be signals or commitments from these companies that they will become more energy efficient over time. And in the area of something like financial regulation, for example, many governments could choose to follow what Canada has done. And for big companies who receive government financial support during the pandemic, there's an obligation on them to report climate risks much more clearly to investors than they have done in the past. And that matters because that allows investors in the private sector to take a more informed decision about which companies are ones that they can support in the future and provide finance to. So there are plenty of opportunities around in a world of low interest rates, but it does depend on action by governments to take advantage of these.
Thank you, Nigel. I belong to that 99% of citizens who were outraged 10 years ago when governments bailed out the banks without asking hard questions. So I would very strongly advocate for any bailout program being tied to a strong climate and clean energy investment obligation. I would also add, as a history fund, that when we look at the railway map of Europe that reflects 19th century military strategy, the big hydropower plants in Switzerland, Sweden, but even in the United States were developed by direct government investment. So I found it slightly absurd that in a negative interest rate environment, we are complaining about underinvestment in clean energy. I think that this is a great opportunity, and probably OECD economies, both in Europe and North America, should rediscover their ability to think big and execute large infrastructure projects, this time for clean energy. Now, we are getting a lot of interesting questions, and we are slightly running out of time. So what I would like to do is pick some interesting things that are coming in. I'm going to pick two questions, and I would like to have some really short reflections, both from the World Energy Outlook team and also from the panel members. One very interesting question that a number of people asked in various channels is that this year we have also seen a massive decline of fossil fuel prices. Oil prices declined, gas prices declined, coal prices declined. How does this relentless flood of cheap fossil fuels affect the energy transition? I think that's a very interesting question. And the other question relates to the optimism about wind and solar. How far we can push wind and solar if we don't have large-scale investments into cheap battery storage? And there, I think both the insights of the World Energy Outlook team, and I would say that I think in Africa, battery storage already plays an interesting role. But Latin America is actually an interesting example of how far you can go with renewables without having resorting to battery storage to a large scale. So let me first invite the WEO team and then the panelists to make some short comments on these questions.
Yeah, maybe I can start with the first fossil fuel questions, and then my colleague Stephanie can address the other questions. And it's true that this lower demand for fossil fuels and lower prices and have an obvious some positive impact on reducing emissions, but also it can have some rebound impact and make this less efficient consumption structure locked in the energy system. So in this delayed recovery scenario, there's a notion about this, we have lower emissions in absolute terms. So it may be a good stepping stone to lead us into the sustainable development trajectories. But I think that we need to note that, and the delayed recovery scenario is much less efficient, the energy consumption structure locked in the system. So it is people driving bigger cars and favoring the private cars over public transport and delaying the replacement of old, inefficient appliances and vehicles into the more efficient ones. And that translated to much less, the slower pace of efficiency improvement. And that is the concern in these cases. So if you assume after several years of delayed recovery, we assume that we get back to normal the pace of economic growth, and this delayed recovery is implied the emission trajectory will be much higher than under the steady policy scenario 1. So I would say the delayed recovery is not the solution to our climate problems. So there should be some countermeasures to the impact of this lower the fossil fuel prices in the locked-in energy system. So I have to say that.
Thank you. Let me ask Mr. Otama that this very low fossil fuel prices, how do they affect Southeast Asia? Is this a headwind for energy transition, or perhaps even a window of opportunity to make energy sector reforms and fossil fuel subsidy reforms in a more proactive fashion?
Yes. I think that's a very valid condition that the lower price of the fossil fuel impacting the alternative choices of the member state on how to go ahead in the current, in the medium term as well as longer term. For the immediate terms and medium terms, the members that are looking at 10 member states of the ASEAN countries are looking at on the, of course, the affordable prices currently that provided by the fossil fuel. And as I mentioned previously, that the projection on the 2040 up to 2040, we still rely on mostly on the fossil fuel. However, the chance of having an energy transition is very much big, and it is important to have it, because in the next 20 years we are going to be the net importers of all of the fossil fuels. That's why the member state also struggling to introduce the technology as well as the potential, increasing the potential of RE and also VRE in the grid. And we've done a lot of studies on those matters. For example, the master plan studies on the interconnection. We try to increase the VRE up until 30 to 35% target in 2040, 2050. Over there, we need to install in more than 400 gigawatt, and most of them we plan to have based on the renewable energy supply. So the reality and also the expected future that we have to face when we need to import in the future, and currently we have a very cheap price on the fossil fuel. So I think it is straightforward that currently we need to really rely on the affordable price, but in the longer term, it is important, may say, the longer term we are going to change the strategy more on the energy transition.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think the power sector integration in ASEAN and a better interconnectivity between the different countries will play a very important role in enabling ASEAN to go further and with renewables. But may I invite Ms. Lucidi to comment on two questions. One, how do you see the role of batteries in electrifying Africa? And the second is the low fossil fuel prices, because of course some of the biggest countries in Africa, including Nigeria and Algeria, very, very strongly depend on oil and gas revenues. So how do you see how the African countries are dealing with the fiscal challenges coming from low oil prices? Are they on track to properly diversify their economies?
Thank you very much, Laszlo, and thank you for recognizing that Africa is not a country. So there's a whole diversity. On one hand, we have the oil suppliers who export oil and rely on it heavily for their revenues, and then we have the oil consumers who are and everybody's benefiting from the low prices, except the oil producers. But one of the interesting things, you mentioned Nigeria and some of these other countries. Yes, they may produce oil, but they don't have refining capacity. So they also import, finished oil products. So on one hand, they're taking a hit from, the low oil prices for their main export, but then they're also making some savings for the imports. And I think it's bringing forward what's been happening in a lot of these oil producing countries. They've been trying to diversify. right? And they've had a long-term framework and so on and so forth, but it has brought everything to head right now. So all the systems that they had in place on trying to diversify the economies are now going into high gear. Some of them are also taking the opportunity to start looking at subsidies as well, because now they can feed off, they can pass through the low prices to the consumers, and hopefully that also helps to balance the budget. So it's a complicated situation even for oil producers. And then there's another category of countries who were just beginning. They had just found oil, right? And they were suddenly, gearing up to become oil exporters, the Kenyas and the Ugandas and so on. So now they have to rethink based on the cost structure about whether it makes sense to actually right now go into full throttle, oil production. So these low oil prices have really put, a conundrum for oil producers. On the other hand, for oil consuming countries, of course, right now when COVID has really taken a hit and really affected the fiscal space, this is an opportunity to make some savings and, invest the resources wisely. And some of the countries that are actually oil consumers are also some of the countries that are really making an investment in renewables, the Senegals, the Rwandas, and so on and so forth. So definitely oil consumers are taking advantage of this opportunity to continue their investment in renewables. But I also want to look at consumers, right? So one of the things that came out from the presentation is that consumers also have a very big role to play in this energy transition. We're the ones who have to go out and buy these electrical cars. So what happens now when oil is cheap? This also now starts putting other considerations on the table about whether we as consumers, now that our costs are coming down on oil, are really going to look at other energy sources. So I just wanted to put that on the table. But again, because our infrastructure is so weak, our grids and so on and so forth, and then we keep on with the impact of climate change, especially for countries that depend on geothermal energy, oil is always a backup. So maybe it's even delaying the transition because now the backup is easily available and you don't have to, focus more on your diversification plans. But definitely, as I see it, the energy transition will definitely will greatly benefit from the current low prices of oil, because even some countries that would have become oil producers and depend on some of these fossil fuels will have a second think about it and will probably look at other more renewable sources. You made a good point about the battery storage system and the fact that Latin America has been able to overcome that by actually having grid systems where you can actually feed in excess energy production. And I think that's a brilliant way to look at it. I do think there's a stepwise approach, because before we build those grid systems that can be able to take into, agglomerate energy sources and feed in and balance consumption and demand, we still will definitely have to be looking at these issues about battery storage. But one of the things that I've also proposed in some of the remarks is that we really need to look at regional grids, so that we're not trying to link up to one mega grid when you could actually be better integrated with your neighbors who may just happen to be across a border. So definitely, I think this is one of the things that we look at when we're looking at the issue of renewables and using the systems such as they've been able to do so successfully in Latin America to overcome this challenge of, excess energy and the battery storage system and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Suji. Ladies and gentlemen, we are closing this first webinar on the World Energy Outlook Deep Dive. I'm very pleased to tell you that we had dozens of very, very interesting questions coming in on the sustainable development scenario, deep decarbonization, hydrogen. Please stay tuned. Those will be discussed in detail for the rest of the week. This is a 1 week deep dive. This is the first time when we discuss the World Energy Outlook in such granularity. I think we had a very exciting scene-setting conversation with some of the leading experts of energy from around the world. So I thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for your panelists for joining us today. Thank you.